It has been 9 years since a tragedy that showed just how difficult fighting gun violence can be. On December 14th, 2012, a gunman killed 20 first graders and 6 teachers at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. It shattered families and sent many Americans into grief over the little kids whose lives were taken. Perhaps you too. Now, years later, the aftermath of that shooting is still playing out. For one thing, the gun manufacturer Remington is defending itself from a billion-dollar lawsuit filed by families of Sandy Hook victims. The company made the assault-style rifle that the gunman used. Now, back in September, Remington subpoenaed the school records of the children and the teachers who were killed in the massacre. Also last month, a court ruled that conspiracy theorist Alex Jones was liable for damages. Mr. Jones had consistently claimed that the shooting was a hoax. If only. Of course, it was all too real, something parents understood immediately when it happened. That included the father of America's first family.
Our unalienable right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, those rights were stripped from college kids in Blacksburg and Santa Barbara, and from high schoolers at Columbine, and from first graders in Newtown. First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad. And by the way, it happens on the streets of Chicago every day.
Both Presidents Obama and Biden have signed executive orders on gun violence, but congressional legislation would be much more permanent and more powerful. In the 9 years since Sandy Hook, lawmakers have failed to pass gun violence laws. Today, President Biden said this continues to frustrate him.
At the time, remember, because of your leadership, we forged a broad coalition and enacted more than 20 executive orders. We came close to legislation, but we came up short. It was so darn frustrating. And it's still frustrating now for you and me and so many others in Parkland, Florida, and Oxford, Michigan, in countless communities across the country.
Speaking of that frustration, Scarlett Lewis's 6-year-old son, Jesse, was killed at Sandy Hook. This week, she got an op-ed article in The Hill. Her simple question, quote, "How many more kids will we allow to be murdered before we start making real change?" Unquote. Let's talk about the prospect for that change with NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. And Danny, I wonder what your sense is of why this has taken so long in terms of the laws as they stand right now and the effort to move the laws in different directions.
In the time since Sandy Hook, there has been very little federal legislation. There were 2 major attempts shortly after Sandy Hook. Both failed. In 2019, we were able to ban nationally bump stocks after the Las Vegas shooting, and that's a kind of specialized rarity that you don't see a lot that allows you to essentially give a single shot firearm and make it automatic. It's not something you see very often. But the reality is that this legislation does happen at the state level. Since that time, since Sandy Hook, states have enacted increasing background checks and other laws, which indicates that it's probably easier to legislate gun safety at the state and local level than it is at the federal level, where you need a Congress that is at least a majority in favor of gun control.
I want to make sure we underscore what you're saying, Danny. It's inaccurate to say that nothing has happened since Sandy Hook. Quite a bit has happened in some states on the state levels. What do you think the net effect is? And I know this is kind of inductive reasoning, but broadly speaking, the effect of having bans on the state level versus on the federal level. Is it substantially the same thing, just in 50 different pieces, one for each state? Or would having federal laws have a bigger impact than even that?
Oh, you seized on the issue. I mean, the challenge with having states legislate in any area is that the result is a patchwork quilt of laws, so that when you travel from state to state, you're covered by totally different laws. If you're a concealed carry permit owner, at least it used to be the case that the laws change depending on what state you went to. So that is the challenge. Even if you have legislation that increases gun safety in one state, in another state where it's relatively easy to obtain a firearm, and with freedom of interstate travel as a constitutional right, it's pretty simple to get a firearm in one state and bring it to even a state with increased gun safety laws, background checks, and all kinds of other safeguards, which is why a lot of folks, and rightfully so, demand federal legislation for national uniformity.
This is also an issue that goes straight to the heart of the Constitution. I mean, it's become a Second Amendment issue. I don't think people have debated any amendment as much as the Second Amendment, at least in recent years. How much is that a factor in the ability to legislate on anything related to gun violence?
First, the Second Amendment is an interesting amendment because it's barely been touched by the Supreme Court, maybe a handful of times in the last couple decades, unlike all of these other rights which get litigated fairly frequently. But you take an example like abortion, if you want to talk about whether or not there will be legislation to somehow chip away at the Second Amendment, well, given the recent Texas legislation on abortion, I think there's already been hints that you might see the same thing in blue states as legislatures may deputize the citizenry to sue people with firearms and thereby get around the Second Amendment, just as the Texas legislature has gotten around the right to have an abortion for women. So that may be the future of gun legislation. But on a national level, you can expect gridlock for the near future, possible executive actions from time to time. But even those are never going to be as effective as national legislation.
We're going to talk more about that ghost gun effort in California in just a moment. But since you brought it up, what do you make of the prospect for that? I mean, the idea that the abortion law, so the case before the Supreme Court now, that Texas's abortion law may survive. Different opinions on whether or not that will happen. We'll know soon enough when the court rules. But this idea of deputizing the public to report ghost guns in California, I don't know. That seems like it could stand a chance. If my neighbor had an Uzi, I could call 911 on him. This feels like just, okay, if they have this gun, you can also call 911 on them. It sounds like it's not that hard to make happen. But how do you see it?
Well, the future of that law you just described would be my neighbor has an Uzi, call 911, get $10,000. And if you create a legislative scheme like that, then I can guarantee you that people will be gladly calling 911. They will be perfectly happy to snitch on their neighbor. And that's exactly what the Texas abortion law sought to do, is not just deputize, but incentivize other citizens to sue each other and sue each other out of a constitutional right, thereby creating an end run around the Constitution. And folks warned, including me back then, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to use that kind of legislation, then a creative legislation in another state could outlaw guns effectively. I mean, it doesn't matter if there's a Second Amendment, if the government, if the state is not taking the action to remove the firearm.
NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos starting us off tonight. Danny, thanks very much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.